Hello, everybody. Warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today for this conference, this webinar on partnering with business to promote human security and the SDGs. My name is Mary Martin. I'm the Director of the UN Business and Human Security Initiative at LSE Ideas, and we're partnering with Rosario University in Colombia. And my thanks very much to my colleague Vesna Bojcic and to Oscar Palma and Juan Sebastian Hernandez at Rosario for organizing this event. It is great. We wanted to, we've called it comparative experiences. We wanted to have inputs from people across the world, and we have this. We're in time zones from Colombia through to Australia. So thank you if you've got up early to be here, and also if you're staying up very late. We've been partnering with Rosario University within the umbrella of a UN project on business and peace and a human security approach to find durable solutions to stabilization and peace building in Colombia. And we held a conference last November in Bogota, which was looking at lessons from territorial peace, asking for the experiences, the stories of people on the ground and how they were experiencing post-conflict solutions to peace, and particularly working with the private sector in that respect. And in this conference today and tomorrow, what we wanted to do was, if you like, extend that conversation. So from looking at it from the ground in Colombia to try and include very different international experiences as well. And as many of you are well aware who work in this field, this is a very diverse terrain and field of research and of practice. There are lots of different entry points and different disciplinary perspectives, from security studies, international relations, to economics, law, human rights, anthropology, and of course business studies and management studies and business ethics. So what we want to do in this conference is capture a bit of all that, the breadth of of academic inquiry, but also very much the practical experiences from business, from other organizations, to understand what we know and what we need to learn, and how knowledge sharing can benefit particularly people on the sharp end of fragility and conflict about engaging with the private sector and mobilizing private sector resources to meet objectives of peace building, human security, and sustainability. So in this first session, I'm delighted to welcome 5 speakers who can help orientate us and our discussions and ground them in some of the wider debates with their perspectives, also from the field. So on this panel, we're going to hear first from Arlene Tickner, who's a professor of international relations at Rosario University in Bogota, from Jenny Pearce, my colleague at LSE, who is a professor at the Latin America and Caribbean Center in LSE, and from Jason Miklian, who is based in Bogota, working for the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Oslo. They're each going to talk for about 10 minutes to give us their opening thoughts. And then we have responses from Marius Decker, who is the Managing Director of Business for Peace Foundation, and Jonathon Kolieb, who is at the University of RMIT in Melbourne. So you see what I mean by we are traveling the globe today, all from the comfort of our own rooms. In the audience, please put your comments and questions into the chat box. And after we've had an initial round from the speakers, we'll come on to those comments and I will kind of relay them to all our panelists. But it's always lovely to see lots of chat and back and forth going on. So I encourage you to do that. We are recording this, and there will be a recording of the session. And I think my colleagues will probably say more about that maybe at the start of tomorrow or at the end of today. But for the time being, let's get stuck in. So Arlene, can I ask you to start us off, please, and give us some thoughts from your point of view?
Thank you. I thought someone was going to unmute me. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Mary. I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate in this conversation. I just want to state from the very beginning that I'm speaking more from a theoretical perspective based within international relations and security studies, more than actual field work, of which I have some, but not nearly enough to be able to talk more directly to experiences with human security. And in these brief minutes that I have, I've been asked to just give a broad overview of the concept. So I'd like to do three things, basically. First, discuss the emergence of human security within international relations and security studies. Second, I'd like to try and identify the main critiques posed towards the concept by both conventional and critical scholars. I identify with the latter most clearly. And third, discuss several strategies devised to what I would call salvage human security and allow it to meet its stated potential goals. As I think most of us know, human security appeared in political and academic discourse in the mid-1990s, proposed in the policy world mainly by the Canadian government and United Nations, in tandem with a number of other efforts to widen lenses through which world politics were viewed and addressed. This was obviously facilitated by the end of the Cold War and the intellectual and political openings afforded by the culmination of the bipolar conflict. Among these, I want to highlight the centrality of the state and of national security as, in conventional understandings of international politics, the central agent and concern of international relations. This figured prominently in these revisions. And to a lesser degree, perhaps, the impact of neoliberal globalization on the well-being of people was in the mind or on the radar of some who proposed a loosening and widening of notions related to security. In very simple terms, human security was initially conceived as safety from chronic threats such as hunger, disease, and repression, protection from sudden harmful disruptions in daily life, or the right of people to live with dignity, freedom from fear and want, and whatnot. And the introduction of the concept into IR and security thinking and practice, I think, had several important implications that I just want to highlight. First, as security studies have pointed out, it shifted the referent object of the conversation on security away from states and towards individuals and other sub-state actors. Second, security threats, which were largely identified with problems originating outside of state borders, came to be seen as located not only outside of the state, but also inside. Third, problems such as disease, hunger, poverty, and others faced by normal people, which would customarily be part of a development agenda, became also security issues as a result of this human security move. And finally, safety from repression, which was normally seen as the responsibility of states, came to allow the international community to adjudicate the right to act if and when states did not provide this type of safety or were actually the culprits of creating unsafety and insecurity. And so essentially the deepening and widening moves entailed by the human security concept, although very interesting, also elicited a number of different critiques and concerns. At the policy levels, its broadness led to concerns about how to operationalize human security with an eye to developing concrete strategies. And this also took place in the academic world, where similar concerns were echoed in terms of the difficulties of developing a workable research agenda to analyze and investigate human security type problems. In both cases, this led to debate about broad versus narrow definitions of what human security should be protected, what humans should be protected from, and second, the so-called Copenhagen School warned of the potential dangers of securitizing human security-related problems, among them the adoption of exceptional and militarized measures to combat these new threats. I think as we've seen in cases such as migration and the fight against COVID-19, this is by no means a minor concern. And so the whole question of what happens when we securitize issues beyond the conventional ones, I think is something that remains to be, discussed and debated more thoroughly. Third, critical scholars and policy circles in particular warned also of the Western colonial roots of human security derived policy. Including, this is one of the drawbacks of working at home, obviously, including humanitarian intervention, the responsibility to protect, and UN Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals, which have been associated by some with a renewed civilizing mission of the international community, including international organizations, powerful states, the private sector, and even some NGOs tied to neoliberalism and the search for a liberal peace, in particular in the global South. Relatedly, many have noted that notwithstanding attempts to decenter security away from the state and towards people, the state actually continues to be seen in human security lenses as the main provider and guarantor of security. As a result, one might argue that states have co-opted the human security agenda for their own goals. And finally, post-colonial, decolonial, feminist, and critical race scholars in particular have questioned who the human is in human security approaches, pointing out that failure to interrogate this more thoroughly actually ignores the centrality of racialized and gendered hierarchies that underscore security politics. And once again, if we look to, for example, the Black Lives Movement in the United States and police brutality against people of color, both there and in other parts of the world, this again, I think, is a serious concern that needs to be addressed. In short, human security may be an attractive concept, as who can be opposed to its normative goals, but it has also been sequestered by states, other actors, etc., converting it into what many deem a hegemonic and neoliberal discourse. So I think the question is, what can be done to recover it and its emancipatory purpose, which I believe it actually does have. Distinct advocates, including Mary Kaldor of LSE, have proposed alternative models of human security that are human rights centered, emancipatory, post-liberal, from below types of approaches that all seek to build on those institutional multilateral arrangements that might actually work in practice, but to decenter the conversation towards the local level. I think the underwriting logic of these being that people at the grassroots level not only know better what their insecurities actually consist of, but need to be empowered as agents acting with their own voices. And yet, in my mind, how to develop such bottom-up approaches without falling into similar traps of co-optation and imposition remains a significant challenge. In other words, how to engage with local populations on their own terms as equal partners, if not the main protagonists in conversations and policy developments related to their own well-being, continues to elude work rooted in human security. My sense is that a decolonizing human security, if such a thing can actually exist, has yet to be devised. And so with this, I'd like to end actually before my 10 minutes are up, hopefully to hear more, especially from Jenny Pearce, who I know is doing fascinating work at the grassroots level, which I think will probably help answer this latter concern that I've just posed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arlene. Very, as you say, very timely, but setting us up nicely, particularly on these ideas of the hazards of co-optation and imposition, which maybe is something we need to bear in mind when we think about, is human security a useful and a valid approach when we come to look at the private sector? I mean, the risk obviously has been there about states kind of sequestering it, to use your term, but you know, then if we go to dealing with the private sector and bringing that into conversations, how does are we going to be able to recover human security, or is it again being undermined? So Jenny, over to you. You were segued beautifully in there by Arlene. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you, Arlene, because what I have to say follows on brilliantly from what you said, because I shared absolutely your skepticism about human security, as well as the potentiality the concept might have. And I'm actually a political scientist that works as an anthropologist. So this macro-micro really interests me, and how by understanding the micro, we might precisely be able to address some of these concerns about big concepts. So I'm a Latin Americanist, as is clear, but I've also worked in the north of England. And I've been very concerned through the work I've done over the decades with the fact that violence and security are at a stage of ongoing and global crisis, both in the meanings we attach to the words and in the practices for addressing them. And obviously the issues of violence and insecurity are particularly acute in the region I do field work in. And I'm not going to give you statistics to illustrate that. Most of them are very well known, but there's just one that always shows me how deep this crisis is, which is that there is today a 1 in 50 chance of dying before you reach the age of 31 if you are a young man from a low income setting in Latin America. And when we have someone like Eduardo Buscaglia in Mexico pointing out that drug trafficking is the 5th employer in Mexico after Pemex, the oil industry, you can see that there's a crisis at the levels of masculinity, at the levels of poverty, at the levels of meaning to life that many young men feel they are born into. And which gives them something I picked up in Medellin decades ago, the sort of sense of a very short span to your life, and it's worth living it well. So in Medellin, the young guys from the combos, the gangs as they're called there, used to say that, yeah, they expect to live only till they're about 30, but at least they'll live well and they'd have had the good life. So I don't want to go down the statistical path any more than that particularly dramatic and something I feel very strongly as I have a son, statistic. Also because measuring violence and criminality in levels of homicides doesn't enable to actually see and understand the problem that's confronting us. The fact that there are so many multiple non-lethal violences. There's violences where the body disappears, which is a phenomenon, again, in Latin America, I've lived with since I started working on Latin America in the 1970s, but which actually is in Syria today has also been a major issue. And in addition, because Latin America is a complex region where the Colombian peace agreement took us out of the longest war in the hemisphere. However, we now have a situation in the region where you have non-war violences and post-war violences. And so violence doesn't equate with war. In fact, I see violence, not war, as the opposite of peace. So there's some big issues to sort of think about there. So we're looking at the whole possibility of whether the concept of human security offers a new way of approaching this crisis and how the business sector might respond. I actually do quite a lot of research on economic elites and violence, but as I said before, I also work on the ground with methodologies for what we call co-constructing knowledge with communities who suffer the extreme violence and insecurities and criminalities in the everyday. But what I've become very clear about is the importance of a process that connects those lived experiences on the ground with all the other actors and domains in society, from civil society to state actors, and of course the business sector is very important there. So how you build from the ground to connect, and whether the concept of human security can be something that connects us is one of the issues that I'm very concerned with. I wanted to just, I've only got 10 minutes, I'm very conscious of that, just a few words about my approach to violence and multiple insecurities. I see violence as a phenomenon with its own distinctions and multiple expressions. And I would like to place violence as a phenomenon much more in the centre of our preoccupations. And this requires us to recognise that all violences matter, and their reproduction and the factors of their reproduction through all the socialisation spaces, from the intimate to the street, to the school, to the prison, to the construction of the nation state itself. Not all crime is violence, but crime and the illicit have grown enormously in Latin America, in communities and the local and national economies, and in politics as well as transnationally. And acting on violence is something which I consider to be extremely important. The agency that, as groups and organisations become sensibilised to the multiple expressions of violence, to all the violences that matter, the action to what I call de-sanction, to take away the acceptance of violence in different spheres and only concentrate on ones that seem to matter to particular actors, that acting on violence has become very important to me. And so I see the recognition of all the violences mattering to the connection with participation, and that enhanced participation would be about then the working on the conditions that reproduce violence and criminality. So there's an iterative process between recognizing that all violences matter, enabling more participation and more action on the conditions that reproduce these phenomena. But who are these actors? Who are the actors that can get involved in this, taking away the acceptance of violence that's so common? Everywhere, I would add, not just Latin America, but other parts of the world as well. And it's one of the reasons I welcome this multi-actor approach. Recognizing the fact that all violence matters and working with those who must live it in the everyday leads also, I think, to a different understanding of security. So when we begin to look at which of the actors and how to work with different actors and share some meaning to the problematic we're concerned with, leads also to sort of rethinking security. And the first thing it leads you to rethink, I think, is the politically convenient idea of a quick fix to security issues, the quick fix of incarceration, of physical elimination and exclusion. Those sorts of policies that still called mano dura and various things in Latin America, which reproduce more violence. And in Latin America, one of the things that's worried me a great deal is as the challenge of violence and insecurity have grown and the inability to deal with it, so what I call authoritarian citizenship has grown. The effects on the idea of citizenship and democracy, which is better that I deny the rights of others in order to gain something of security for myself. And that's very, very convenient to politicians to appeal to that sense of I'm prepared to deny the rights of people. I don't care if they rot in prison, if they're killed in prison, as long as I feel in some subjective way more secure. So we have a real problem there on the one hand of authoritarian citizenship. And on the other, even before the pandemic, the issue of social distancing in Latin America, we might call it inequalities. But in actual fact, there's a social distancing in a physical sense in Latin America. As those who've got more money, and so here are business people, I'm bringing you in, you can self-isolate from the problem, and you can employ private guards. And we have a situation in Latin America where there's many more private guards than there are policemen per capita. So we have also an issue there. So acting on violence and crime and insecurity requires what I call a distinct kind of security consciousness, one that doesn't promote that socially distanced understanding of how to approach the problem or the authoritarian quick fix, and one that, as I've said before, leads to some connecting of all these different actors. Well, of the domains to connect, civil society, state actors, and including business actors who are also in civil society as well as in the economic sphere, the domain that I think is hardest, because it's the most complex and the most contextual, is the domain of the neighborhood, the street, the community, which varies so much throughout Latin America. And is where poverty, deprivation, social, criminal and state violences intersect. The fact they intersect does not mean, in my experience, that there is no possibility of conscious capacity to act for that agency. And tomorrow, my colleague Alexandra Kolieb will speak about the methodologies we've used in detail about how to work on that agency. how to connect communities, academics, what we call pracademics, practitioners, who are also academics, and community researchers who live in these spaces of the community, how to work to co-construct practical, realistic ideas for addressing these lived experiences of insecurity. One of the things that I've learned from working on the ground, we've worked with these methodologies first in Medellin, but also in Tegucigalpa in Honduras, in El Salvador, Guatemala, and most recently in 4 municipalities of Mexico, I have come to appreciate the concept of human security. So here we come back to our conceptual discussion and whether this concept, with all its potential for hijacking, as Arlene has pointed out, or emptying of meaning, whether it can be re-signified by action on the ground and by building with all these different actors around the concept. Well, I came to with lots of doubts because I thought the concept was so broad. I didn't actually believe it could be anything more than a top-down concept. When I began to work on the ground with communities experiencing what I call chronic violence and criminalities, immediately people on the ground would say, seguridad humana, human security, yes, that's the security I want. And I realized that it touched a nerve with people because they didn't want to choose between the violence they lived and the fact they had poor housing, their kids couldn't, especially their young men, but also young women, of course, couldn't get a job. The fact that they had very poor health services, the environment they live in with no public spaces and fear at night. They wanted to link all the domains in which they felt insecure. And that, for me, was really the light bulb going off. The human security concept at least enables us to connect the multiple experiences of insecurity and the reason why those young men think it's better to die young, because they're never going to have a sustained life with a good job and some recognition and dignity, and why crime becomes more important. So security consciousness and working with communities was about exchanging knowledges from their experience on the ground with my academic experience, with those of civil society organizations and actors and community actors, to articulate proposals for what we call the building of agendas for human security. If you go on the Latin America and Caribbean Center website, you can download all the agendas of human security that we co-produced with the different communities we work with in Mexico, in Spanish and in English, and you will see what this means. So to bring this to conclusion, ultimately, what did we learn on the ground from working at the community neighborhood level about the idea of human security, whether it could be made a meaningful concept, but also one that could translate into policy and practice and bring in other actors in the society, including business? Well, one of the things we learned was people who are living these environments on the day-to-day have what we called, and people themselves gave us this term, collective trauma. You live loss of life, loss of loved ones, you live with permanent fear. It's collective trauma over decades. Distrust in the police, because the police often reproduce violence. The political and criminal actors exploit insecurity and offer their own form. Violence, I don't like the term criminal governance very much because it doesn't enable us to see the violence that lies behind the orders that criminal actors construct in these areas, and often politicians gain because they can buy votes from this. We learned about the differential experiences across gender, generation, sexuality. In Apatzingán in Mexico, people said better not to see nor to hear. So how do you enable the atomized, fragmented and traumatized to build that sense of agency, to join in processes of rethinking paradigms? So building on the ground requires accompaniment, it requires engagement. This is something that academics aren't necessarily encouraged to do, or even business sectors, and civil society actors often find it difficult because these are dangerous environments, but also because often you're engaged with kind of dealing with the state actors. But I would say without the people on the ground, you are not going to get anywhere. You will just get exploitation of their fears. So building the agendas, we managed to kind of present those to the Congress in Mexico and to many other entities, but I'm continuously looking for how we could find new ways of making sure these agendas become practical possibilities by engaging with these multiple actors in the field. And so I would say the concept of human security, we have to make it work. We have to build it. It means something to people on the ground. It's possible to make it work with other actors. Agency matters. The conscientization, Freudian term, which always I love very much, about how you learn and about your work, your role in the society and the structures around you. This is an approach of a methodology that matters to getting people to understand their consciousness. But the final thing I'll end on is that it's not just about the concept, it's about humanizing the idea of human security, or humanizing security. That actually, at the end of the day, if you have a security that reproduces more violence, you will never, ever deal with the problem that we're trying to address. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was a fantastic tour d'horizon from concept to practice. And Arlene had asked us who is the human in this idea, this concept of human security. And I think, you know, Jenny reminding us that it's, for example, amongst many others, it's a young man in Mexico who might be likely to die in his 30s. So that the stakes are incredibly high. And in the midst of that, how do we understand agency? And I think for us, with what we do in trying to connect the concept of human security with the role of the private sector, mixing those two, perhaps, you know, oil and water possibly, but which is what we try to do in our program. I think the idea of agency becomes very critical, because clearly business is a powerful actor and often has a lot of agency, maybe in the wrong directions. So I think that those two presentations, thank you, have given us some great conceptual backdrop. Now, Jason is also going to ground us potentially in Colombia, where you are, but he also works on many other areas of the world, and he's going to move us more, I think, into this the position and the role and the conditions for the private sector to act. So, Jason, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary, and thanks, Jenny and Arlene, for, I think, really setting the stage well for us and showing, you know, not only the concept of human security and, you know, why it's, you know, so complex and difficult to work through in places, but also how important and essential it is. So now I'm left with this, you know, perhaps unenviable task of figuring how in the world does the private sector fit into all this. And that's been a big part of my background, which is in it kind of goes between development studies, international relations, peace building, with a focus on the private sector. So if I am so sad I don't have a nice bookshelf in my background, but hopefully I can at the very least have a bit of PowerPoint here to give something a little bit more exciting for people to see. All right, can we all see me now? Great, okay, excellent. Great, so what are we talking about when we're talking about business and peace? So roughly the core of this concept is the idea that the private sector can and should support peace building, sustainable development, and human security around the globe. And not only that, that companies should play these more expansive roles in society with an aim to be more constructive actors. There's, you know, this push comes from many different places. So I can start here with just a couple of quotes from successive UN Secretaries General that regard how they see the role of the private sector fitting in today. Ban Ki-moon said about 6 years ago that we call upon all businesses to apply their creativity and innovation to solving peace and sustainable development challenges. And in turn, the UN will foster a dynamic and well-functioning business sector. His successor, Antonio Guterres, took it even further, saying that companies actually must be a driving force to push governments to assume peace responsibilities. And if they do this job properly, they are indeed contributing decisively for peace. So now, of course, this is a subset of actors in the world of peace building and human security, but it's a growing one, and one in which the business community itself is increasingly engaged. And you see this, I try not to do too many statistics either, and mine aren't nearly as good as Jenny's, but you do see today that you know, over $7 trillion US in investments is directed to be SDG compliant, and some 95% of the world's largest 500 companies claim to support the SDGs. And not only that, many of them see SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Sustainable Institutions, as the most important SDG for them to work within. Now, one interesting thing is that more often than not, the solution to peace and the reason why businesses are brought in is this notion that they may, they not only have agency in conflict and fragile and conflict-affected areas, but they also perhaps have more innovative solutions than other actors that work in this space. So now Mary already talked about, some of these links and all the different people who are talking about the relationship between business and peace. So I won't do too much more than that, but I will focus a bit more on what businesses are saying. A lot of the motivations have come up in the last decade, perhaps the last 15 years, underpinned in the notion that just making profit is unacceptable now. It's unacceptable to shareholders, it's unacceptable to societies, and it's even unacceptable to the employees of the companies themselves. But that said, profit can't be squandered in the pursuit of the peace. So then they look for solutions like, quote unquote, creating shared value, delivering a responsibility to society, corporate social responsibility. There's a number of different ways and mechanisms, guidelines that businesses undertake to try to show and contribute to peace building and human security. And as Mary said, there's academics are all over the place. Yeah, anthropology, development studies, management. If you're looking for an argument to support something that you want to do, you'll find it in academia, no matter what side of the spectrum you're on. So let's dig into the details a little bit on, what's going on around the world and some of the key ways that proponents for increasing business ties and peace and human security say that businesses can help. And these are in rough order of, the actual impact that they make upon peace building. The first is that, just businesses being in fragile and conflict-affected areas facilitates peace and sustainable development by growing economic ties. This is a version of the old liberal economic peace argument where, if countries have strong ties between them, they're less likely to go to war. This concept has been taken down into the intrastate level, and it's often used as a reason why businesses should go into rapidly expanding in fragile countries. The second is that local development leads to local peace. That if businesses can improve local development in their operational areas, it will help make societies more peaceful. The third is that international norms can improve democratic accountability. That foreign firms in particular can help support democracy by importing norms and ethics that would improve the structural conditions for peace and change what are often pejoratively called corrupt local mindsets. And fourth would be the work doing to try to change the root causes of conflict itself. These are economic, political, or structural actions that aim to end conflict drivers themselves by improving material conditions that lead to peace. This can be everything from inequality to other sorts of drivers for conflict itself. Fifth and most rare is when companies actually undertake direct diplomatic efforts themselves, where they become mediators or offer their support and a real stake in creating a durable peace, either at the local, regional, or national level. Now, of course, when we talk about business, it's not a monolithic actor. Businesses are different. Different departments within the same business can be different. Regional firm or variations between firms, between regions, between sectors. But the one thing that we should probably think about is that, generally, of course, companies are not evil in their actions and they're well intended, but perhaps they don't go out of their way to do as much good as they promise. And now the most visible break that we often see in this discussion, it's great that we're talking about it tomorrow as well, is in the tech and innovation sector. One very quick example I'll give here is, of course, many of us know about Facebook's misadventures in Myanmar and how they were implicated in fomenting ethnic cleansing through the use of their platform. And it took years and years to get Facebook to recognize and then to finally ban members of the military junta. But what is, interesting and perhaps extremely frustrating in this area is that even knowing all of that, other foreign technology companies that went into Myanmar repeated all the same mistakes in the last year. The picture that you see here is of members of the military using TikTok after they were banned by Facebook to promote their message. So they just go from platform to platform, and the cycle of damage repeats itself. Now, I just mentioned this here to show how important it is for, and I echo Jenny and Arlene here, for companies to really understand local context. And technology companies in particular have a very difficult time incorporating this into their design. So for any company that wants to really make a positive impact, the local context is essential. And to do that, we really need to go beyond management studies or business studies to really help guide the private sector in these roles. Because as we see time after time, companies very often do what they think is right based upon corporate social responsibility best practice, but without a human security perspective, without a community perspective, it can often still fall apart. Now, of course, we all know that the challenge of that is getting them to actually listen and to implement those sorts of suggestions when the local community tells them what is important. Now, I'll talk very, very briefly about some of the research I've done in Colombia, because it can show, some of the complexities in trying to have these multi-stakeholder approaches, but also where we see ways in which the private sector, development agencies, and local communities can work together. As we all know, Colombia is one of the world's most complicated conflict settings, with a complex multi-decade war between FARC and the government, between other insurgent actors, drug mafias, organized crime syndicates, paramilitaries. It's really, really complex. But the business community, for several different reasons, has been more involved in times than in other conflicts around the world. And there's many reasons for this, including the length of the conflict itself, the role of domestic firms are traditionally more powerful in Colombia, and the historically deep integration between business and government. So we did interviews of many CEOs on how they try to work through violence, how they try to help build peace, and a couple of the quotes are up here on the screen. One CEO said the question was clear: what do I need to do so that the insurgents don't plan to bomb in my factory? Do I call the army, or do I build 6 schools? So they try to understand, like, do I go the security approach, or do I go the human security approach? Very often businesses see it as an either or. And then another CEO said, well, if you want peace, you need to sit down with the barbarians. And I think it's important to recognize here that, when he said barbarians, he didn't mean just the rebels. He's talking about the entire ecosystem of conflict actors, including the government. So one of the projects that we've looked at is in coffee in Colombia, and particularly the role of the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, or FNC, which is a very large guild of 500,000 coffee farmers. And they're a very successful, very powerful actor within Colombia. But about 15, 20 years ago, they started running into problems. Coffee prices were crashing. The conflict was creeping into the places where the farmers were growing, and they were failing. They were not able to solve these issues. So they needed a new approach. So what they did is they partnered with the Spanish Agency for International Development. And the idea was to try to merge best practice in business with best practice in peace building to try to help local communities. So they did a very large 10 million euro project with 3,000 beneficiaries, 250 facilitators, 30,000 beneficiaries over hundreds of villages in coffee growing regions, which were also conflict regions. So it was this innovative development model that was indirect on peace, but it focused primarily on community engagement and communication. So I'll talk very quickly here about some of the things that tended to work well or better than many other business and peace initiatives. Because this was, the dozens of these sorts of things I've researched around the world. This is definitely, it's not perfect, but it was one of the more successful ways that business and development agency can work together. So, we find out through this footprint, the FOP is called the Footprints of Peace. That was the name of the project. So in the research, it was easy to see that companies do have unique abilities and skills that can be used in collaboration with others to help build local development. And this can often be a very contentious statement because, especially on the critical side, especially with academics, there is absolutely a very legitimate concern that should the private sector be involved in this at all. But we did find that firms can be successful local development agents if done in partnership with other actors. Second is, the FNC itself has a major vested interest in the community. Their time horizon is forever. So they are very invested in the local community already, which makes peace and development ventures more likely to succeed. And they did this through leveraging the unique advantages that they both shared. The development agency did the design of the project and the FNC did the implementation. One of the big things that the FNC does is they took on the reputational risk, because if the project would have succeeded, they share the gains with the community and with the development agency. But if it would have failed, it would have been damaging to their own reputation alone. And this was a new way to think about business and peace projects more generally. And firms can indeed tackle conflict drivers through development initiatives. So the project, helped lead to local peace and help generate local peace building with respect to community integration. And this was, we interviewed a few hundred farmers who went through the project and also went to several of the local communities. So per their experiences of this, they found this to be a comparatively more beneficial project than ones that the government or other foreign aid actors had done. So the key here was by uniting everyone with the most to lose from war, including, the business, including local government, including local communities, farmers, and even the FARC themselves, they built a peace that was more durable than many other projects could achieve. And I can circulate an article that goes into this in more detail if one wishes. I'm a little bit late on time, so I'm going to skip this, which is the next project we're working on, which is looking more at local business and peace and development in particular. But I'll just end here with talking a little bit about some of the forward debates that we see in this space, and also that will be talked about over the coming days. So of course, this notion of business, peace building, human security, it's very complex and it raises a lot of big questions. And one of the biggest challenges, especially on the business side, is to try to temper or tone down the promises and aspirations that are made. Very often, businesses can get very excited about these new initiatives. When businesses can be very hesitant to jump into peace building. But when they do, they can get very excited about it. And one of the dangers that we often see, especially in local communities, is the businesses that comes in that overpromises and underdelivers. And that's a big ongoing challenge in this space. And not least because, especially larger businesses can often do both extreme good and extreme harm in the same community at the same time. So they undertake positive innovations like, maybe building a school or a hospital, but at the same time doing things in their operational activities that are negative for the community. So motivation is a core thing that I think is important for us to research further, because, this topic touches quite closely to the business and human rights agenda, but we can also expand that into human security by interrogating it a bit more deeply what the purpose of a particular corporate peace building action is, and what are not only the intended consequences, but the unintended consequences. And this is something that especially development agencies are much more sophisticated at and have gotten more sophisticated at in the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years. But it's something that especially businesses, large CSR departments, they don't have that articulation. And then we can also talk about, the notion of effectiveness. Very often firms are problem solvers, and they think of things in terms of risk and profits, and that if they just get the conditions right, there can be some sort of business and peace solution. But as we all have said already today, there's no blueprint for what's effective and what works in business, peace, and human security. It's really local context that's the key, and the challenge is not only getting businesses to listen to local communities. That's the easy part. That's what most businesses do. The challenge is for them to consider what they are told as equal to their operational agenda, which is much more difficult. But what we found in our research, and this is really the crazy thing, those firms that do actually listen tend to be more profitable and tend to navigate risk and crisis in such spaces much more adeptly than the firms that don't. So I think that that's our big challenge as academics, is to be able to get firms to understand that that actually listening to local communities and taking their needs as part and parcel of a business's strategic goals can make the business more profitable and the community more secure. And it's an extremely challenging pitch to companies. And I'll just close with again, I'll just say that the corporate social responsibility does not equal human security, but we can get closer. There is a place for business. Under the right circumstances, a business can be part of the solution, but it can only be ever a contributing player. It's very rare, or if not impossible, for a business to be the solution itself. Thank you.
So much, Jason. That was a great sort of example of some of the key, I think, sort of pillars of what we see also as the usefulness of linking this concept of human security. As you very rightly say, it's not CSR. It takes the private sector into a new terrain, which one sensed was very uncomfortable and unfamiliar for them originally, but clearly, the tides of events, not least COVID, are moving in that direction. So I think our feeling is that it becomes more appropriate and more relevant, more salient for business. And emphasizing, and thank you for emphasizing, obviously, the kind of the local context point, because I think when we started our program a few years ago, one of our senses was that there was a conversation going on around sustainability and, as you say, a little less on peace building, but that was just at an elite level. It was taking place within the kind of the titans of industry and maybe the UN and so on, but it doesn't percolate down to the ground. And going back to one of Jenny's points, how do you get that kind of sense of security? And as you've also referred to, bringing out the capacities of local communities in the sense of seeking appropriate forms of peace that works and development that works for individuals on the ground. How do you connect that, if you like, up the chain? So I think we've got, I feel like saying to the audience, just hold all these thoughts, because we've got an awful lot of nice kind of points here to hang on to. But I'm going to turn next to Marius, because Marius is absolutely in the eye of the storm of Business for Peace, and knows from, I think I can say, Marius, both sides of the fence, as it were, from a business career, but also what you do now in the Business for Peace Foundation, how this works in practice. And maybe if I could invite you to respond to some of the points that we've heard from our three previous speakers, and give us a bit of your sense of where we are in a kind of practice position, and maybe comment on also the kind of the academic debate as you see it. Marius, please.
Thank you very much, Marian. It's lovely to be here and take part. We come very much from a business perspective, and a much more practical side to this. I think from where we're at and what's working, or rather not. I think one of perhaps the positive things is that I think businesses are now seeing more than ever their relationship to peace and prosperity, and I think we can I think that not only the COVID, but the SDGs have really brought that to the forefront. And we can look at something as clear is, for instance, the so-called ESG indices in various stock exchanges, that they are performing, outperforming, businesses that are not focusing on it. So I think there is a momentum building around the business world. At the Business for Peace, we are, we have a, we're really here to recognize and inspire and accelerate what we call business-worthy leadership. And by that we mean that, for us, business-worthy leadership, it's a kind of a normative deal. Businesses have an obligation, to help create value for all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And they're increasingly seeing that the link between, a profitable business and a thriving economy. I mean, there is not much business in a failing economy, and this is at least not sustainable long-term profits. And we're seeing this to a greater extent now. So the historical perspective that businesses are purely maximizing profit and maximizing entity without regard for kind of social impact, that's kind of quickly becoming outdated, at least for the larger corporates around the world. We certainly believe that businesses can do good and do well at the same time. So that's and we are we're working on and we've spent the last 10-12 years really kind of promoting individuals that are have understood this and have created successful businesses in many cases in very, very difficult circumstances. And we're seeing a number of other actors now promoting the business's responsibility in all of this. And I think as I said, we're coming from this from a practical perspective. I've spent my entire career in business and kind of grown came to age in this kind of neoliberal paradigm where they only have been to business school in the United States, and for the past several decades we've been told that as long as businesses make money, they will do social, they will kind of create social good, and that is clearly not the case. I think businesses have a huge responsibility. I think it's the reason why a lot of kids they basically are forced into to crime is that there are simply not economic opportunities for them. So we certainly believe that if businesses understand their social impact, and it's almost businesses depend on a peaceful society, and in turn and can certainly help create that. But I think we need to hold them to a higher standard. And here, the dialogue and things are changing. Look, for instance, such as SDG impact, where we are trying to put in place standards, and we make them report on it. Those are crucial tools in order to kind of create an even playing field and to kind of elevate their role here. We need to drive that, and back to Jason was talking about it. To make businesses understand that their long-term profitability, depends on them taking a whole different approach to all stakeholders. So, and as we've said, purely maximizing profit, or as we call kind of financial extraction, that really only benefits the extractor. And as I think Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, said in a recent letter to shareholders, that if businesses can't issue a 30-year bond, they have a serious problem. So here we are hopefully with the help of the current pandemic seeing a growing kind of understanding that their role in peace building around the world is paramount. but personally, and we haven't really discussed it, but something that is of great concern to me is really the technological revolution that we're seeing now, and how that will really maybe undermine some of these things that we're trying to achieve here. That, you know, more and more businesses are automating. You know, where are the future jobs going to come from, and a kind of potential conflict that will arise from that. That's something that I would love to discuss more. So yeah, as a start, that's from our perspective where we're at. So yeah.
Thank you, Marius. Thank you. I think very useful to highlight that if we are in the middle of, one hesitates to talk about paradigm changes all the time, but if we are in the middle of some kind of evolution, it comprises behavioral change by businesses and seeing a different set of motives really for engaging, but also something you touched on, which was bringing back in the role of the state. We need regulators, we need level playing fields. So this isn't just a business responsibility. And if we go back to the idea of what kind of security and for whom, this idea that you need multi-stakeholder, multi-actor initiatives all feeding into each other. And that in itself, of course, is challenging as a process, but I guess that is the goal. Thank you so much.
To bring businesses truly into this dialogue is crucial. I mean, it's not two separate actors. I mean, they need to be brought into this, multilateralism in a different way. I mean, we need to create a kind of a governance structure here, if you will, that includes businesses. And we need to obviously hold them to a whole different standard, but it's not either or. I mean, it's all part of the same discussion.
Absolutely, which sort of takes us on quite neatly to Jonathon. Jonathon is joining us from Melbourne, so thank you for staying up so late, Jonathon. And Jonathon works in a few areas that are really relevant to this discussion. Business and human rights, I think, humanitarian space as well. You've done work with ICRC, but I think, from the business and human rights discourse is very different. It is more about kind of compliance and holding companies to, perhaps we can say, almost minimum standards. So give us your thoughts on what you've heard, Jonathon, and how do we go forward, either in an academic debate sense or in practice terms?
Thanks, Mary. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep, fantastic. Thanks, Mary, Vesna, and all the other organisers. Thanks for the invitation to participate. One of the great pleasures of COVID has meant that we've all discovered Zoom. So for folks like me in the Antipodes, it's meant that we can be part of these conversations, and sincerely hope we can connect going forward as well. May this be the start of other conversations. Before I go further, I also just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining from Melbourne, Australia, where it's just ticked over midnight. But in particular, wanted to respectfully acknowledge that I join you from the unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the first peoples of this land that I'm on, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I am the discussant here with Marius as well. So I feel like my job is to share a little bit about what I'm doing, but really to reflect on what the panelists have said. So I've been furiously jotting down some notes. So forgive me if this is more stream of consciousness, but hopefully there's some provocations there that we can perhaps pick up as well. But here's a few thoughts. I think Mary's right that business and human rights is a really relevant discourse that we need to be bringing into this conversation for a whole variety of reasons, not least because it has really captured the attention of big business. If you look at those annual reports that Jason referred to, the sustainability reporting, they all use the language of human rights. So it behooves us to sort of engage, I think. I didn't think, Jason also spoke about academia that are interested in this space of business and conflict, business and peace. What was left off Jason's list was us lawyers, us legal academics. So I didn't think I was going to have to be a cheerleader for the law and lawyers for this conversation, but I think there's a value add that we can provide. And perhaps by entrenching some of these conversations and activities in the law, be it human rights law or humanitarian law or other law, maybe we can also help address some of the concerns that the panelists have already flagged and legitimately flagged. So Arlene asked, for example, how do you operationalize human security? This is a concern, this is a difficulty. Well, perhaps human rights and thinking of compliance as a first step, respect for minimum standards is one way to go. I work closely with the Australian Red Cross and in coordination with ICRC in Geneva about embedding humanitarian law into the policies and practices of companies. And as I reflect on it, now that's a silo amongst silos, right? We're not talking about peace, justice. It is literally a niche within even the law sphere. Certainly not a holistic approach to peace building, but it is much needed, in my opinion. Exhibit A, all the governance instruments and multi-stakeholder initiatives that engage with business and conflict, business and peace do refer to the laws of armed conflict, to international humanitarian law, but they do a very poor job of actually operationalizing or leveraging them for any great effect. The voluntary principles on security and human rights, for example, the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, both refer to the value in conflict-affected areas of respect for humanitarian law. And yet we do a really poor job of implementing that and sharing that with companies. So in my experience here in Australia, speaking with some of Australia and the world's largest companies, you can think, for example, in the extractive sectors, the knowledge of humanitarian law is simply lacking. It's not that there's an unwillingness to implement or think about it in terms of their engagement with local communities when they go and have operations in conflict-affected areas. They are simply unaware of its utility. And so that's what we're trying to address. So I think there's a conversation there around the role of law within this human security conversation. A few other thoughts. The securitization of human rights. This is certainly something, and the securitization of human security. So let me talk a little bit about that. Again, from my experience, when we talk about business and conflict, business and peace, with companies, those conversations are often shunted to the security officers, to the security personnel, or if we're lucky, to the risk managers and the compliance officers. So I think it's also behooves us to be conversant in their languages, number one. I think it was Arlene or Jenny or both said, how do communities have voice? I think that's absolutely legitimate. We also need to be thinking about how do companies find their voice, and we need to be talking their language as well. But as well, I think it's really important that we think about how do we get out of that securitization mindset of human security and engaging businesses in conflict-affected areas, so that other operations managers, human resources officers, other aspects of a company are also engaged in thinking about these issues. Now, a few other provocations, if I may. There is a cacophony of acronyms and instruments in this space. CSR, MDGs, SDGs, R2P, BHR, VPIs, and those are just the ones I can remember from the past hour. So how is human security paradigm, is that a value add? Where does that fit within the cacophony? I often get tired of the amount of toolkits, guidance documents that are out there, and I do wonder if there isn't some rationalization that's needed. Perhaps a provocation again, and be really curious what Marius, for example, has to say about this too. I think Marius said that companies have an obligation to create value to all stakeholders, not just shareholders. Well, I want to agree with that. I do personally agree with that, but the law does not. And I would suggest that many companies do not either. So how do we align the laws? And is it possible to align the laws and corporate mindsets with that approach? Jenny asked I thought, some really telling questions. How do we humanize the human security? And Jenny, I really appreciated that you wanted violence to be contrasted with peace, and that there's all manner of expressions of violence. So let me sort of provoke, is the modern day corporation a manifestation of violence? And if so, what then about our shared agenda of engaging with them? Now, I'm not presupposing the answer to that, but I do think that this should be constantly in our minds as we engage. There is a danger of co-option and of corporatization of really important social processes. I've probably got a bunch more to say, but let me end with just one point, Mary, if I may. And it hasn't been mentioned to date in this conversation about the role of business in conflict and to build peace. I'm writing about it right now, so it's on my mind, which is the role of the consumer as instruments of corporate behavioral change, of improving corporate behavior in conflict zone. Where do we think the consumer comes in? And whilst the geographic focus of a lot of the conversation so far has been the location of the conflict and of the community that we are building peace in, but there is also another audience, another partner, potentially, the global community of consumers that are purchasing the products of many of these companies. I think there's peace building power there too, and I'm curious of your thoughts.
Jonathon, thank you so much. That was great, and prodding us nicely in all sorts of directions, not least to think about and guard against falling back into these silos, whether they're of academic discipline or, you know, what we see, as you pointed out, in practice is that companies, if you like, partition and demarcate their organization of this kind of engagement and their responses. You know, sometimes it is the lawyers that drive the conversation, sometimes it's the risk managers. Often it's very under-resourced corporate responsibility. So I suppose my question then to that would be, does human security help us to get anywhere near being a sort of cross-cutting issue, that we get out of some of those practice silos at least? Or does it just, something else you touched on, does it just add to the cacophony? And that's sort of the reply we often get from companies: don't give me another concept, you know, I'm just getting my head around sort of business and human rights, I can't deal with something more. So we really, you know, the onus is on us to demonstrate the kind of value added. And just a really good word about bringing up the consumer, because we talk about, I suppose it's like silos, we talk about people, companies, entities as if they are singular propositions. And I think, as Jason pointed out, the private sector comprises all sorts of colours and hues. But within each category, you get people who are, to use that lovely term the EU uses the whole time, double-hatted or multi-hatted. You know, you and I are academics, but we're also consumers, but, you know, we're also... So companies have people that are part of the community, clearly, as well as corporate. So how do we make sense of that messiness, if you like, that is real life? We don't have too long. We have about 20 minutes. So I'd like to throw it open to the audience to put in the chat box any kind of particular questions or comments you have, and I will try and relay them. But while we're waiting for people to do that, just to invite any of you on the panel to respond to anything you've heard from each other in terms of, you know, what are the kind of hard questions in all this? What are the real nuts that we need to crack, if you like, in thinking about this, and perhaps how, as academics, we can clarify or you know, move these debates forward. Arlene, I can see your hand.
I thank you all for such thought-provoking comments. I just, Mary's asking us to identify some of the hard issues. Jonathon posed perhaps one of the hardest, I think, in his question about whether or not capitalism is a manifestation of violence, and if so, what do we do? I personally believe that it is, especially in its neoliberal guise, an agent and reproducer of violence of many types, as Jenny has laid out so thoughtfully. So. What do we do with that? I am not sure, but just in listening to those who conduct field work, I think there's multiple experiences in which, even though we might not all agree on things, and in this case, obviously, the private sector would not necessarily buy into the idea that capitalism of the neoliberal type provokes violence. There are points and there are points of communication and overlap that I think do actually lend themselves to joint conversations and to agreements to act jointly. And we see this happening not only in the realm of peace building. I think we're seeing it increasingly, for instance, on issues of sustainability and the environment. And so, you know, I don't think that incommensurability should be taken as an, you know, an absolute obstacle that can't be overcome through conversation and the types of strategies that Jenny has laid out. And just one other thing I wanted to mention that Jonathon also pointed out. I mean, concepts, obviously, we don't want to overwhelm anyone with a ton of them, but I think that securitization as a concept is fundamental to have on our radar. And I say this for several reasons. Just in listening to Jenny's presentation and her very sad but true statistic about young men in Colombia. This is a product of securitization in many ways. And so, you know, my sense is that not only the security sector, but communities, private sector, and a number of different stakeholders writ large need to understand, you know, what security does. And so Jenny has me convinced as to the merits of human security and the need to humanize human security. But I still do strongly believe, in particular in contexts such as Latin America, that the temptation to militarize and to adopt these type of quick fixes that Jenny has pointed out actually do pose a pitfall, if not a risk, to, you know, considering a wide range of issues, security issues. And so I just want to insist on that point because, especially in contexts of institutional weakness, such as those that characterize a country such as Colombia, if not Latin America in general, I think this is a serious concern. That's all I wanted to say.
Arlene, can I just come back to you very quickly, because I know I've got others who want to speak, but do you see then, if we think about the private sector, is your concern about securitization heightened when you come to then looking at the private sector? You're speaking from Colombia, where there is a kind of history where, business has been co-opted, obviously, but is now also trying to be co-opted by the government, by elites to build, if not call peace, then stabilization. So where do you think business fits into that concern of yours about securitization?
Well, based upon what you describe, the private sector, can easily become a securitizing agent or an agent of securitization, as instructed by the state. And so my sense is that at least some degree of consciousness about, again, what security does and what the risks of, considering a myriad number of issues, security problems or threats, is fundamental. I don't think this means that the private sector, I think we've heard a number of convincing arguments as to the worth and merits and fundamentality of private sector involvement on these issues. But I think a certain degree of consciousness as to what these things, what these words, what these concepts do is important. And again, I've had this conversation with this, actors in the security sector many times. My sense is that, security agents themselves don't have a sense of what security does. And so raising that consciousness, to me at least, is something that's fundamental.
Thank you. Right. I'm going to go to Marius next. You wanted to say something, and then Jenny, and then we have a couple of questions from the audience too. Marius, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, a couple of points. First of all, as was said earlier, that businesses have a huge agency in this, and sometimes used for good and sometimes not. I think. And to the point of whether capitalism provokes violence, I think unchecked capitalism certainly can do that. But also I think we have to recognize that, private sector also provides an enormous amount of innovation and social good. But it cannot operate in a neoliberal paradigm. There needs to be checks and balances. And one obvious point here is that if you're focusing purely on the bottom line, as measured by money terms, there's a huge amount of externalities that are not accounted for, and in a sense that basically leaving that for someone else to pick up. So it needs to be well and truly regulated. I think that's now, and not just voluntary standard. It needs to be regulated so that there is an even playing field, and that they pay for their externalities that they. So that's kind of just one point. And I just want to also very quickly pick up on Jason's point on the role of the consumer. And I think that's if consumers really use their power, businesses would very quickly change. If we stop buying products that are being conflict avocados from Mexico, if you stop buying them, then we would very quickly change corporate behavior. So I think, and what can we do in order to kind of increase the the consumer power? One obvious thing here is, for instance, labeling. You need to know what these products contain, where they're made. That's maybe one way to kind of increase the consumer power in this, and that I think would have a huge impact. And we are also seeing it coming, that more and more consumers are being environmentally conscious. They are stopping buying certain products, and they are shifting their behaviors and consumption to more sustainable products. So consumers, I think, is an big asset in this if we can just tap into it properly. But that will require regulations.
Thank you. Some of you may remember the case a few years back now. I did some work on, which was Veolia in the Palestinian territories, and it incurred a huge worldwide consumer boycott because it was doing business with building the Jerusalem light railway, which connected the illegal settlements. And to Jonathon's earlier point, I remember doing some work contrasting legal approaches, because there was a recourse to international law to stop the company, versus the worldwide consumer boycott. And the feeling was very much that the worldwide consumer boycott had the power to stop that contract and that behavior much more than international law did at that stage. I'm just going to jump in because I've got two questions. Jason, hang on. Can I just ask two questions from the audience, because they're to you and to Marius. So Hugh Sanderman, who's from LSE Ideas, is asking whether you panelists could clarify what types of businesses you think are most effective in engaging in building human security, whether it's local, national, multinational, consumer-facing, process industry, mining, where are the good lessons? So that was a question from Hugh. And sort of related from Oscar Palma from Rosario University, again to Jason and Marius or others who want to jump in reality, how aware are businesses of the contribution they could make in building peace, especially big companies in conflict regions? Is there a sufficient consciousness of the power that they have? So perhaps, Marius, you could address those questions, and then we'll turn to Jason, and then I'll come back to Jenny, who I know wanted to say something earlier.
Well, I think that the general understanding in the business community is poor. This is not, or at least wasn't when I was in school, was not part of the curriculum. We talk about marketing and production and finance. We don't talk about human security and the role of business in fostering that. So I think it's a lot of work to be done in raising the awareness within the global business community and their role in this. To the question about where they can, where businesses can play the biggest role, and I think it's on multiple levels, but certainly the multinational corporations with large and complicated value chains. I mean, I think they would take, for instance, the whole the battery and the mobile industry, looking at the enormous amount of wealth that's been created from it on the back of some basically poor children in Congo digging cobalt. And they also, I think it's in local context, maybe it has a big impact, but I think that the larger corporations should have the resources and the knowledge and also the profits to maybe hold themselves to a higher standard. So that would be certainly, in my head, one place to start.
Jason, you wanted to come in anyway, and perhaps you could respond to Hugh and Oscar.
Yeah, I'll do a big swath of rapid fire comments that don't really connect. But I'd just like to reiterate, based upon what both Jonathon and Marius said, like, I think all business, we realize that principles and standards absolutely have a place. But the danger is when businesses use them as this warm, cuddly cocoon and think that their job is done. They're never a substitute for action, especially when they don't have a punitive element. So they're often these sorts of principles, standards, ESG, due diligence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we can consider them as more of a starting line instead of the finish line, I think that's a more constructive way to think about them. Yeah, and then it kind of goes to this question of, okay, yes, we want regulation, we want to hold businesses to a higher standard, because without accountability, there's very often not change. But of course, everyone then asks, well, who regulates it, under what authority, what are the conditions? There was a comment in here about sovereignty. Which states get to decide who builds this regulatory mechanism. I think that one of the most interesting debates going on right now is in this boycott space. So you have maybe something like 50% of millennials have boycotted a company in the United States in the last year alone. It's a tremendously powerful mechanism. But then you see the other side of it, where millions of people in China are boycotting firms for not using slave cotton in Xinjiang. So then, these boycotts can cut both ways, especially when they're used in the service of nationalism. So it's very important to recognize and think about, what we recognize as, something positive and good and a positive change mechanism in some countries may be the exact opposite in others. To get into Hugh's question, in my experience, and it'd be great to hear from other people about this too, it's not necessarily a particular sector or size of a firm that tends to be more successful, but more ones that really operationalize societal concerns and operationalize not just risk but socio-political risk into their daily operations before the conflict or the crisis comes up. They tend to be more successful and more respected by the community. And I would add it with that, those who work in partnership with, not just development agencies, but also local governments in community formats tend to be much more successful than those who work alone. And to Oscar's question, yeah, it's a really tricky one. This is about, how aware are businesses of the contribution they make. There's a ton of variation in it. I would say in these areas, some firms maybe don't see it as a priority, especially ones that aren't tied by territory to a given area. Some see it as, it's not their place, it's not their business to go into that, especially local and domestic firms. Some see it as just too hard or too complicated to engage. But most times businesses are just like people, especially smaller ones, they're just trying to get by themselves. They're trying to work through the conflict as best they can and not try to be the big problem solver in society. Where we see the most action is very often by activist CEOs. A CEO, usually an owner, who takes a personal stake in conflict resolution. And this is something we see a lot, especially with the Business for Peace Foundation and the people that they support. It's people who've taken this step as individuals as well as owners of businesses or CEOs in order to try to generate peace building and human security by themselves.
Thanks very much, Jason. Jenny, you wanted to come in, and I don't know if you want to respond to any of the points you've heard recently.
I just wanted to come in, like others have, on the capitalism and violence, Jonathon's very interesting question, which I think is a very critical one, because we all know that, and we've discussed it, there are different sectors of business, etc. So I just wanted to make 3 very quick points, because this is a subject I'd love to spend the whole day on, but anyway, we can't. One is, we mustn't forget that there are economic interests that have actually been directly involved in violence, and I don't think we should forget that. And I mean, you couldn't understand Colombia without, and other places without understanding, for instance, the ranching sector, cattle ranching, and links with death squads, it's in paramilitaries, etc. So that's just one point I wanted to make. But then I wanted to say that when I began my own work on economic elites and violence, I wanted to interview the more sort of globally orientated business sectors to see how they understand issues of violence and insecurity. And I was struck, talking to Sindicato Antioqueño, for instance, and some of the Grupo de 10 in Monterrey, I was very struck by how it wasn't until the violence touched them that they felt they could act, right? So when we had kidnappings, and you couldn't go to your farm in the countryside for weekends, and your family were in danger and risk, they began to realize that this was an issue. Well, I think it's very important to sort of say that we can't obviously leave this issue till when it touches people, but it's touching people more and more. I mean, issues of extortion. Well, someone mentioned the avocado growers and the limoneros, the lemon producers in southern Mexico. Extortion is a huge issue for sectors of business. But so when it touches them, they act, but we can't leave it at that. And that leads me to a third point, which links also to Jonathon being a lawyer, which is critical to this whole discussion is, when do elites invest in the rule of law? So when does it matter to business groups that there is not just a rule of law in a functional general sense, but a rule of law that is accessible to everybody and meaningful and equitable, right? And I've been very struck, for instance, by in interviews I've done in Colombia, how it's been suggested that actually, you know, elites, once if the commercial law operates, they're okay, they don't have to worry too much. Therefore, they neglect criminal law or civil law. And so how is it you get economic elites to realize that, you know, the law must work for everybody, and it must be a means of reducing violence? Very interesting what's happening in Colombia at the moment with HEP and the restorative justice kind of approach they're taking. How do you get elites to kind of come in? There's lots to say on this, because it feels to me that this is an absolutely fundamental question, not just about reducing violence and enhancing security, but also obviously dealing with corruption.
Mm. Absolutely. I think what you highlight is just how many shades of grey there are in these discussions. I mean, your point originally about, you know, violence is and there's a spectrum also, because I think a lot of the reaction we get sometimes from companies is that well, we can't go into either. We don't exist in conflict areas. We're not, you know, they're thinking of Syria or something like that. And you say, well, you operate in Mexico or you operate in Colombia, you know. So the spectrum of violence, which obviously at the head of it is sort of armed conflict, but that isn't the only form. But that how do you cater for all those sort of variations and nuances along the way? And I think something that Marius mentioned in his intervention originally, that these are also governance questions, because while you want the private sector to engage, what we find a lot is that just doing it unilaterally or doing it with some kind of philanthropic, almost paternalistic view also doesn't work, because actually that just reproduces a kind of violence. So so I think governance is also an important question in this, and how you do governance in a way that gets the private sector into the conversation, but sort of manages the ways it operates, and that asymmetry of power, which, you know, underpins everything in these multi-actor conversations. Unless anybody is burning to say anything finally, I'm going to bring the session to a close. As Jenny said, we could go on all day, and it's been great, thank you. But I think you've really set the scene well, reminded us of how complex and rich and deep all these fields are. But I think it sets the stage for us to go on to the next session and hear some more about particular contextual experiences.